I'm Kyle Wathan. Welcome back to my series on simulating adaptive clinical trials, where to start and how to expand. I hope you enjoyed the previous two videos and found them informative and educational. In this video, we will extend the simple approach from the previous video and start developing the framework by adding functions to accomplish various tasks in the simulation. This will allow us to extend the previous single script to have multiple scripts or files so that we can add more complex and innovative adaptations. We'll begin by defining a few tasks that we have to do in simulating a clinical trial. One of the main things that we always have to do is simulating the patient arrival time. In a fixed trial, this is not necessary because everybody is followed until the end of the study and their complete data utilized. Whereas in an adaptive trial, you actually have to know when they enroll and where you are in the trial making adaptations so that you know what data would actually be available. In most studies, you need to be able to do some sort of randomization or treatment assignment. So we'll actually think about that task. We'd look at simulating the patient outcomes. After all, that's one of the major pieces. It's often best to build the patient simulator or the function that simulates the patient outcome and then try several iterations to make sure that the simulation of outcomes matches what you expect in reality. We need to have a function that would create the patient data at an interim analysis that would then go into the analysis and make decisions. For example, if you were changing the randomization rate, potentially stopping early for efficacy or futility, these are the kind of things that you would need to create the data set for. Of course, you would also need to run an analysis and then make decisions. So we'll actually separate those tasks into two different functions. And then we would need to do one where we're going to be able to keep summaries over many iterations. In this, where we're only simulating a couple scenarios, it's not as important, but in more extensive ones that we'll get to later on in this series, it'll be more important. So you think about the tasks, and we're going to take the tasks that we have to accomplish and turn them into functions. So for example, simulating patient arrival times, I always like to use very descriptive names, and I start with camel case. So for example, simulate arrival times, where the first letter of each word is capital. This makes it very easy to notice where you have functions within your R code. It's always best to start with a verbal description so that you can check back to the function that it does actually what you had intended. So with this one, what we would like to do is to simulate the arrival time according to a Poisson process for each patient in the study. The inputs would of course be the quantity of patients and the recruitment rate. In many trials there's actually a ramp up, but for simplicity we won't consider that for now. What we would like is for this function to return a vector of length with the number of patients. This would represent the start time in the trial for each patient. The next task that we're going to look at is randomizing patients. We're going to call this get treatment because there isn't necessarily a reason that you have to randomize. You could actually be doing dose selection and hence it would actually be an assignment. So we're going to call it get treatment. What we would like to do is for this function to be able to determine what treatment each patient receives. We'd like to call it before each patient, so if we were doing something like adaptive randomization, more particularly outcome adaptive randomization, you would have the data, be able to send it in and get the probability for randomizing a patient to each treatment. So the idea is that it would require the input that it would require would be the randomization probability, and it would return the treatment that the patient receives, where 1 would indicate that the patient received E, the experimental, and 0 that they received the standard of care. We need to be able to simulate patient outcomes, so we'll name this function simulate patient outcome. Again, using camel case, where we make the first letter of each word in the name capital, all others are in lowercase. The main reason I don't use dots or underscores in between the names is because that's just extra characters to type and makes the names even longer. What we want this function to do is to give a treatment is to be given a treatment and true response rate, we're going to simulate the patient outcome. So the inputs would require the treatment, where we either have S or E, and the response rates for both. What we would like is for it to return a 1 if the patient responds and a 0 otherwise. In other more complex settings, such as time to event, maybe multiple outcomes, this function could do more, but for this case, it will simply return a 1 or a 0. Now we'll switch and look at the task of simulating a single virtual trial. What steps would we need, and how would we utilize the functions that we've developed for the previous tasks? The first step is you would need to simulate the arrival time for each of the patients in the study. Since we've built a function for this, you would simply be calling a function. The second step is that you would need to know the treatment for each patient in the studies, so you'd need to randomize or assign them to a treatment, which we've built a function for. The third step is we'd need to simulate their outcome based on the treatment that they received. We would then need to repeat steps 2 and 3 for all of the patients in the study. If we were actually doing interim analysis frequently, during that repetitive process of step 2 and 3, we'd need to also run an analysis. But for this example, we won't do that. You would then need to analyze the data and then finally make a decision about the trial based on the results that you have simulated and accrued. At this point, we're going to pause for a code challenge, allow you time to work on the templates and see if you can fill in the necessary code so that you can complete the simulation. Good luck. At this point, we're going to jump into the R code and actually take a look at the solution. We'll actually have 2 files open. The one on the left will be the simulate trial.r that is in the template folder, and the one on the right will be the actual solution. This will allow us to look at what goes into each of the blank spaces that was provided. I hope that you're able to get most of them and actually able to perform the simulation. At the top, what you'll see is a block of code where the patient outcomes are simulated, the patient treatments, and we create a vector for keeping track of the number of patients on standard and experimental. So what we would need to do to fill these in, if you correctly did it, is each one of the first 2 would require the number of patients that are going to be in the trial. So you would simply be repeating the NA for that number. The reason that we want to initialize these vectors is so that as you go through the loop that is further down, if something were to happen and you ended up with a vector of NAs, you would know that there was a bug in your code. So it's often very good practice to start by initializing the vectors that you're then going to fill in. In the next set of code shown here, we were going to simulate the arrival times for each of the patients, and then the next step, the V observed time, is actually the observed time that the outcomes were observed. In order to calculate when the outcomes would actually be observed, for simplicity, we're simply going to add 1 to the time that the patient was enrolled. So if you actually were to look at the solution, what we've done is we simulate the arrival times using the function that is developed in this solution, and that would generate the vector of start times for each patient in ascending order. The very next line, what we're doing is we're taking those start times and we're going to add a 1 so that would actually be the time that the patient outcome was observed in the trial. This is important because if you're doing frequent analysis, you need to know if an outcome is actually observed or if the patient has been enrolled and treated and that outcome is actually not observed yet. It becomes very important when you're creating the data sets and doing more adaptive features. The next step is we'll need to go through the loop. If you look at the template code, what you'll see is that you're going to loop over each of the patients, and in that loop, the idea is that you want to generate the treatment, replacing the NAs that were originally initialized above, and then the patient outcomes, and keeping track of the outcomes for each treatment arm. If you look at the solution, what we're going to do is use the other functions that we'll develop, some of which we'll review in this video, The others are left for you and the code is provided. For example, when we are actually getting the treatment, we can call the function getTreatment that was already discussed in the task list. And in this particular instance, since we're doing all equal randomization, we'll send in a fixed probability of 0.5. If we wanted to do something like outcome adaptive randomization, we could simply change this to be the probability that we're wanting to use to unbalance the randomization. After we've gotten the treatment, we now have the input that would be needed for simulating the patient outcome. Notice that the simulate patient outcome takes the treatment and the true response rates, and that way we're able to simulate whether the patient was a response or a failure. The next step is we need to keep track of the outcomes, since those are going to be the posterior parameters in the calculation that we're going to do. Flipping back to the template, in the next line of code, what we're doing is we're taking the observed time of the very last patient, and that's going to be when we would want to run the analysis. This is the time at which the patient was enrolled and is the last time that the last outcome is actually observed. What we would like to do is to calculate the probability that S is greater than E and the probability that E is greater than S, because this is what we'll use in our decision making. So if you look at the actual solution, what we've done is we're going to get the time that we're running the analysis, then we'll actually run the analysis using the function that is there. One important feature of using functions rather than actually hard coding this in is if we wanted to change the analysis method, we wouldn't necessarily need to change the function, just the actual implementation of run analysis. This would allow us to easily try different analysis methods and understand how each one would perform in practice. Note that the next line down, then, we're going to take the analysis and the calculations that we got and use it to make a decision. From there, we'll return a list of the things that are of interest in what we're wanting to do to be able to have and summarize at the end of the simulated trials. In the interest of time, we're not going to go through the solution to each function, but we'll go to the main ones. For example, the run analysis is a little more complicated than the other functions, so we'll take a look at it. Again, on the left we've got the template, and in the right side what we actually have is the solution. So if you go to the template, what you see is that we are going to start at the top, and there are several spaces where we're taking the information that was sent into the function, assigning it to the variables such as the posterior, and then we're going to update that through going through the loop and figuring out exactly what each patient's outcome was. One very important step in this is that we are looking to see if the current time that was sent into the run analysis is actually greater than or equal to the time that the outcome was observed. If it's not, we can't use it. Even though the patient outcome has been simulated, where we are in the current trial, that outcome would not have been observed, so we can't include it into the analysis. That is in particular in this step right here. If you have any questions, please post them below. So now we're going to skip from the template to the actual solution, and what you see is that we're going to take the input parameters that are the prior and assign them to the posterior. This allows us to simply loop through and accumulate the number of responses and the number of non-responses so that we have the posterior parameters at the end of this and can easily calculate the probability that one treatment is better than another. So this loop will actually go through, it will calculate the posterior parameters, and in the final step, calculate the probability of interest. Looking at the template, if you got down to here, there would be many ways that you could do this. You could hard code it directly into this file, but the idea is that we're trying to approach things in terms of functions rather than hard coding. This allows us to easily switch from one thing to another if we'd like to try different analysis methods. In the current solution, what we actually have is that we're simply calling a function called probability x1 is greater than x2, and this is based on the parameters that are sent in. The exact definition is below, and you'll see that it actually uses the built-in function integrate within R. Since this is a closed form, integration is sufficient and we can actually do this. In other more advanced options, we may need to do MCMC and use things such as JAGs or STAN, and we'll get to that in later videos. The last function that we're going to look at is the main.R. Again, on the left we have the template version, and on the right we have the solution version. I hope that you're able to figure out exactly what went in each space. The main loop in this function is one where we're actually going to simulate and run across the number of reps that you want for the simulated trial. Essentially what each loop does is it simulates a single trial, captures the results, and stores them in a vector. One key thing to keep in mind is that once you call the function simulate single trial, the return object is a list. So in the next lines, what you're doing is you're accessing the elements of the list that you want to capture and summarize. I hope that you found this video helpful and informative, and look forward to the next video where we'll begin doing more adaptions, putting in interim analysis, and looking at other things that we could do with the various types of adaptations in the trial. Please remember to subscribe to the channel so that you will get updates about new videos. If you have any questions, post below and I'll answer as quick as I can. Thank you and see you next time.